Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking all things internal controls. Now, particularly as it relates to computer controls, because I know a lot of students struggle with this. So I'm going to do like a topic summary as well as some pointers on exam technique. Let's get into it. So I know I don't have to tell you guys how broad this topic is. I'm not going to be touching on manual type controls or the business cycles. I will just mention them in passing, but I think the main focus of this video will be internal controls and just controls as a concept. What are we trying to do? Why is it important, and so forth, right? So why is this important? Well, put simply, you cannot audit what you do not understand, right? So as part of the planning process, the auditor goes on this thing where he tries to understand the client. He tried to understand, for example, the commercial realities of this client or how the client makes money. The auditor would then go on to understand things such as the management and the governance structures of the company, the environment in which the client operates. The auditor would go on to try and understand how transactions are recorded, what internal controls are in place, amongst other things. What are internal controls? Internal controls are processes, rules, or procedures that are put in place to ensure that the operations of the company run efficiently. This would include, for example, making sure that the assets of the company are safeguarded. This would ensure making sure that there is proper record keeping, and this would ensure that the people that work within that company are able to then comply with rules, policies, and regulations that are in place. So we can almost say that controls will then follow the risk of an error, right? So because the company has identified that the risk of an error exists, they will then put in place, for example, preventative controls to make sure that that doesn't even happen. And where it then does happen, when error does then take place, they would then have detective and corrective controls to ensure that that error is addressed. Now, I want you to always think about this at the back of your mind. I'm going to get to this much later on in the video. The module is usually divided into the different business cycles, so your revenue and receipts, your purchase and payments, your inventory production, your investment cycle, human resources. And computers is almost always taught like as a separate kind of standalone thing, but it's not really separate, because if you think about it, computers can be incorporated into any of those business cycles. And I mean, fourth industrial revolution and so forth, computers are a huge part of our lives. It's not something that we can escape. And if you think about it, I don't think that there is any single business that follows a purely manual process. The smaller guys might be able to automate like some smaller components within their business cycles, and the bigger guys that have like enough of a budget to automate majority of their process are able to do that. Now, in terms of audits and what the purpose of an audit is, it does not change whether you're auditing a manual or a computerized environment. You would need to understand the controls just the same. And that's why for this module, you almost have to put on your IT hat a little bit. In fact, I remember this one time my students wrote a test, and afterwards they said that they're not sure if they were sitting for an IT test or if it was an auditing test, because of just how intense the computer controls are. So it's not something that you can run away from, unfortunately. You will need to learn it, but you know, there is some logic to it. So if you just apply yourself and hopefully pay attention to what I'm saying in this video, you should be able to do well. There are two broad areas of computer controls, and that is the general controls as well as the application controls. So general controls, as the name suggests, is more like of an umbrella. So it speaks to the software, the hardware, and other manual controls that are in place that specifically shape the control environment, right? And so that would include things such as how a system is developed, how it's maintained, how it's monitored, how access to the system is controlled. Now, in terms of popularity, access controls within general controls is a very popular topic. Now, please hear me properly. I'm not saying that that's the only thing that you'll ever get asked as it relates to general controls. I'm just saying that it is quite popular. It is a favorite for the exams. In fact, up until the APC. So you see it a lot in the ITC, you'll see it in the APC, and trust me, you'll also see it during CTA and undergrad. So it is worth spending some time on this topic. So as far as the control environment goes, within access controls, the company obviously wants to make sure that it has a proper access control policy. Now, what good is a policy unless it is actually used and used properly by the employees? And so you then incorporate things just such as making sure that the people that have to use this policy are well trained on it. They're well aware of its contents and well aware of how it affects them. And then controls that relate to protecting the system would include things such as making sure that there is proper or up-to-date antivirus software. You'd make sure that there are firewalls. You'd make sure of things such as virtual private networks. And then there'd also be physical type of controls that would aid in restricting access, right? So if you think about, for example, making sure that certain modules or certain applications are can only be accessed through specific machines. So if you think about, say, the people that pay salaries in a company, right? That module that allows them to be able to do that that software should only be put on a person's laptop if their job is to actually do that. So in order for you to access that system, you'd basically need to get that person's laptop. Other types of physical controls would be where they lock the actual computers or devices. They would like mount them onto the wall or on a desk, so that the only way you can actually access this machine is if you come into this room. Now, if you go to a residential university, you can think about your computer labs where the computers are actually mounted onto the desk. So if you want to access your school's software, whatever, you would then need to go physically to use that laptop. Or if you needed to use that laptop, you would need to physically go into that room. Other types would be having restrictions over, say, the use of removable devices. So I remember when I worked for a bank, the laptops did not allow you to send any information onto a USB. It was just strictly blocked because of the kind of sensitive data that banks deal with. And so that would be an example of a physical control. And another type would also be, controls around making sure that whatever information is then printed, like the hard copy stuff, how is access controlled over that? Should they then be shredded? Do you go leave the stuff somewhere? Is it someone's job to then make sure that they shred all of that stuff, or whatever the control would be? So those are like the kind of examples within that category. Another category would be a user type controls, and so what this means is that controls need to be able to authenticate the user. So to say, are you the person that you say you are? So if B has to log into the system, are you actually B? And then part of another component of this would then be the authorization component, to say that should B even be seeing this data? Should she be doing this function? Can she be approving this thing and stuff? And so with regards to authentication, there you can think about controls such as, requiring a username and a password, and maybe multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor authentication being like a second layer of protection. So if you think about if you have to log into like your Instagram account or your YouTube account before it grants you access, it can then also like send you a third kind of, or it can send you a code on your email address or on your cell phone number for you to input so that you can gain access. So those are the kinds of things. And with regards to the authorization component of it, it's where you basically say, I don't know if you guys have heard in the movies where they'll say stuff like you're on a need to know basis, meaning that you don't need to know this data. It's outside of your pay grade, right? So it's something similar to that, where the rules basically say that information should be granted on a least privilege. So you should only get access to information that you need to be able to do your job. Now, this is called different things by different textbooks. So anything, if you hear, textbooks talking about least privilege access, or making sure that there are access profiles that are linked to the person's job, or it speaks about multi-level access, and so on and so forth, it's all just saying the same thing. So think about this, like you're on a need-to-know basis. Everyone should be on a need-to-know basis, because now if you give me too much access, then I'm able to get access that, I can abuse it, I can delete stuff, I can see stuff that's not for my eyes, and so on and so forth. And then also, when I do get the access, what kind of access do I have? Is it read only? Is it a read and write access? Am I a super user, which means that I can effectively do anything that I want? So people need to be given the right level of access in order for them to be able to do their job. So I know that I've had like different categories of named the categories, like your user, your physical, whatever the case is. That's not as important as understanding the actual controls themselves. The reason why I did it like that was just to help you kind of visualize that all controls are important, right? So those concepts are there for you to try and understand, but not so much for you to be able to categorize, especially if you're higher up in your degree, because no one cares that you're able to know or define what a physical access control is. What is expected of a student who's that far up in their degree is for you to demonstrate that you've seen that this company works with hard copies, right? And so I would expect some form of physical access controls, or I'd expect at a minimum for there to be an access control policy, because that's such an important place to start, and other people then trained and so on and so forth. So don't get too stuck on the categories. The only reason I did it was just to help me explain to you, but I'd much rather have you focus on the controls that we're discussing, and for you to kind of then understand why they're there and why they're important. And so before we get into application controls, I want you to think of like your general type of controls as your operating system for your phone, right? So either Android or iOS, you need that there to begin with on the device in order for you to be able to download any additional applications. So iOS would be a general kind of control, and then your WhatsApp or YouTube would then speak to the particular application. So it goes without saying that your WhatsApp and your YouTube would obviously rely on the existence and the proper functioning of your iOS software in order for them to function and at their peak as well, right? So please bear that in mind. And so the question becomes, what does work properly mean? Well, when will an application be deemed to be working properly? An application will be deemed to be working properly if there are good input controls, good processing controls, as well as good output control. Let's start with input controls. So input controls would be controls that need to be in place to ensure that the data is essentially free from error, right? And what do I mean by this? So first and foremost, we need to make sure that the people that are inputting data into your system are the right people, right? So can or should they even be having those rights to do that to begin with? And then once the data is being input, do we have controls in place to pick up errors or to flag errors and to ensure that all of the data has been put into the system? It sounds complex, but I'm gonna speak to you guys by means of an example, and I think it's gonna make, then you're gonna be like, oh, okay, that's what it is. I know. So I like using this example where I say that picture yourself shopping on any online platform. Let's use Takealot as an example, because I think a lot of people would have used that, or using an ATM, right? And as we talk about these input controls, I want you to then think about whether or not those applications actually have good controls or not. So first and foremost, we'd want to make sure that the person who's inputting the data is the right person, right? So you'd expect that there would be some level of authenticating the user. So by means of a password, a username, the really fancy guys will even use multi-factor authentication, as we spoke about, or any other form of authentication. So if you think about an ATM, you don't necessarily go to the ATM and put in like a username and a password, but you do have like your card that you need to actually insert so that the machine can authenticate that the person who, in theory, that the person who has the card is you, or rather the person who has the card and knows the PIN is you, right? And so the next phase would then be when you start interacting with the app. So if you think about, for example, when you have to put in your ATM PIN, can you put in letters? No. When you are using Takealot or whatever the case is, where you have to fill in, there's a form that you have to fill in that would contain like your name, your address, and stuff. This is now when you're signing up to Takealot like the first time. The next time, as soon as you log in, all of that information is saved on your profile. But let's assume that you were filling the stuff in for the first time, right? Can you put letters where your name is required? No. Can you put you can put letters where your name is required. In fact, that's what I expect, but you can't put numbers where your name is required. And where your cell number is required, I'd also expect that the system would need to block you from being able to input letters, right? And we call that like an alphanumeric test. So the alpha tests, which means alphabet, should be on fields that only require alphabet, so like a name field, for example. And the numeric test would need to be on fields that require numbers, such as like your cell phone number, your ID number, and so on and so forth, your PIN code at the ATM. So you expect, so those controls, even though it's not something that you've ever thought about when you're busy interacting with the system, those are actually application controls that have been, or input controls that have been put in place within that particular application. Now you think about, for example, controls that allow you to check if the information that you've put in somewhere is consistent with data that is expected based on something else that you've put. What do I mean by this? So for example, if you say that you live in South Africa, this is now back to Takealot. If you say that you live in South Africa, the expectation is that your number would need to start with +27, right? And as soon as those two things don't speak to each other, it would maybe like flag it and ask you like, are you sure? I see this doesn't go hand in hand, or whatever the case. If you also think another thing that is common is where you're asked to retype your password, where you're asked to retype your email address, because what it's effectively doing is that the control is trying to match two sets or two fields against each other and make sure that those are actually as they should be. Other things would include a control in the email field, where it says that at a minimum the person needs to enter the @ sign, because you can't have an email address that doesn't have an @ sign, and there must be a dot something at the end. And as soon as it doesn't comply with that, it would then flag it for you and say that you know the please include proper format, or whatever the case is. Other things would include things such as, for example, if you want to order say items, it wouldn't make sense for someone, say, not really it wouldn't make sense, but it's highly unlikely that someone would want to order, say, 1,000,000 items, right? So it's just like on a reasonableness kind of basis, trying to test, did you input the correct number of items that you're wanting to buy? And also another thing, there are things that will be universal, right? Things that will be universal, things such as, what's the word? Postal codes. In this country, there would be, I'm assuming, an exhaustive list of postal codes. So then it could say you can choose from the drop down as opposed to you putting it in yourself, because as soon as you input the numbers yourself, highly unlikely that you're going to make a mistake. Things such as gender, you can pick from the list. Things such as which town or which country you live in, you can pick from a list as opposed to typing it in yourself. All of that is part of you trying to, is part of the system trying to make sure, guide you in the way that you should input the data. Another thing that's quite common is if you then trying to fill in a form online, you will get some sections that are marked with a tick or an asterisk. And what that's trying to do is to say to you, at a minimum, I expect you to have completed this data, because the person on the other side needs at a minimum this data. And what happens if you don't complete everything? It doesn't allow you to proceed. There's going to be like a pop-up message that says you forgot to do this, and so on and so forth. So all of those things are like controls, those pop-up message, you being allowed to only pick and not type where possible, it telling you that, I don't expect someone's name to have a number, or it being programmed in such a manner, is all designed to help you make sure that the input is actually correct. Now, there are so many types of editor validation checks. Please make sure that you familiarize yourself with it and learn them, because trust me, everything that we've just spoken about will come up in some test somewhere in your life, okay? So the sooner you learn about this, the better. And you don't even have to like cram. Like if you're visualizing this shopping that we're talking about, for example, now I'm just thinking of when you make payments. You can't have a credit card expiry date that is in the past, because it means the card has expired. So it's going to automatically flag that. If you're supposed to put in your date of birth, you cannot put in a date of birth that's in the future, because then you're not born yet, right? So all of that stuff, and I'm sure you've come across this at some point in your life, right? All of that stuff is part of input controls, stuff that's designed to help you make sure that you do it properly. So just learn like the different types. You don't necessarily have to know them by name. I think what's more important than knowing that this is a sign check, for example, is you being able to give an example to the examiner to say, for example, the system should not allow the user to input a negative quantity. Or the system should not allow the user to be able to put numbers in the name field, as opposed to someone who just says there must be an alpha test on, like, or there must just be an alpha test. So don't get too stuck on knowing or knowing them off by heart. I think rather know what they represent and be able to then describe to the examiner what the examiner needs to know about your understanding of the subject. And I think before I move on from input controls, you might also want to learn about like batch data and how that impacts like the input and the processing as well as the output phase. Now, what is batch data? So this would be data that's not recorded as and when it happens, right? So it would be something like it's all recorded at the end of the day. So there'd be like thousands of transactions within that particular batch. And so, or it would say something like it's recorded every 4 hours, or something like every time there's 50 transactions, that becomes a batch, and then that gets transferred or that gets now recorded as a batch. Now, back to my earlier point about the fact that controls would follow the risk of error, you now need to say to yourself, what would the risk be there? Like as soon as you're transferring stuff in batches, what is the risk? The risk might be that, you live out like a little transaction there that doesn't get posted or doesn't get transferred to the other side. And so there needs to be controls that ensure that the batch that went into the system is the batch that was then ultimately processed, which then becomes the output batch. In terms of input controls as a concept, not necessarily dealing with batch controls, but input controls. There is a very good question in the January 2020 ITC. The question is master bus, and it actually asked some good stuff on general controls, if I'm not mistaken, and there was also stuff on input as well. So if you can work through that question, I think that might be life-changing. Okay, I'm not going to spend as much time on processing and output, but I think you kind of do get the picture in terms of like the expectations from you. I would advise you to try and make sure that you find questions that address like all three kind of stages, if I can call it that, right? So for example, if we think about processing controls are concerned about making sure that information is processed as it should be. So if we expect that when we make a sale, the process there must then be that VAT needs to be added automatically so that the output of the final sales price, whatever, contains everything. That's kind of the expectation, to say it's going to be 100 plus your 15, that will then give you 115. A very simplistic explanation, but I'm just trying to kind of highlight for you what we're dealing with here. In terms of a very good question on this, on processing controls in particular, please go and look at the 2022 January ITC. I think the question was called Rainbow Tea. It did ask about processing controls, and let me tell you this, right? As far as application controls, input is the easiest, followed by maybe output, because there's not really much happening there. Processing is like, I don't want them to pass. Okay, I kid. But it's the more difficult one of the three, right? So now that I've directed you to a question, please go and see what this is about. And again, think back to what I said, that the main or that a control follows the risk of error. So the error here is that we have information that we're putting into the system. We expect it to come out of the other side looking a certain way, because we expect that the system needs to process it the way that we want it, or the way that we expect it to. What are the risks? What could possibly go wrong during that process? And then what are then the controls that would then mitigate that risk? And when you now work through that question, everything that's there is essentially trying to address this question, where you say, if stuff is not, I just need to have a warm fuzzy feeling that the stuff has been processed the way it's supposed to be processed. Now adding that onto the mix, that question also had like batch data, and so there is like a component there that deals primarily with batch processing as a concept. I think it's a very excellent question. Please go and look at that. And last but not least is to then say, again, I expected the data to kind of come out a certain way from the other side, and so is that the case? So then some controls in this particular kind of category would be comparing like what comes out with what went in. Did it come out as expected? Was it processed properly? So they're all kind of like interconnected in a way. And I think if you find, I don't have a suggested question for this because I didn't have time to search for one, but I think if you just go in and search like for an output application controls question, you should be able to find one. And then if you then, what's this? put it next to the muster bus question that I told you about, the rainbow tea question that I told you about, then you'll be able to almost visualize and see the differences between these three categories of application kind of controls. And I think, yeah, that's that on that. There's not really much happening in this particular category. Now I want us to get into the exam technique for this types of questions. Now, the bad news is this, right? No two system descriptions are exactly the same. That means that for a company that is a service provider, a company that is a manufacturer, a company that is a wholesaler, or whatever other type of company, their controls will not always be the same because their risks are not the same. And so the controls that they would have designed would speak to what they would have deemed to be a risk within that particular business cycle. So you can't cram your way out of this. You cannot say, if I do enough revenue and receipt cycle questions, I will nail every revenue and receipt cycle question. It really does not work like that, right? And I think that the focus here is usually on allowing the student to critically interact with the system description, with the business cycle in real time, and be able to identify, for example, what the risks are, identify what the weaknesses are, and then give recommendations where necessary. Talking about risks, weaknesses, and recommendations in terms of the types of questions that you will find in this module, you will find one like that where you're asked to identify the risks, the recommendations, the weaknesses. It can be two of the three, it can be one of the three, it can be all three. You could be asked to design a system of internal control. I believe that these are some of the hardest type of questions, right? So if you get asked, design a system of controls that speak to revenue or whatever the case is, I think that's really, really hard. They would typically be worded by saying, they'll typically be worded by saying stuff like, describe the controls that needed to be in place, or that would need to be in place to ensure 1, 2, 3. So yeah, there's that. And then there's also questions where you are required to test the controls. So you're given a set of controls and you're asked to identify the key controls and test those controls. Key controls, that typically means, does this control prevent or detect a misstatement? If it is able to do that, then it would be considered a key control. I've noticed that students would struggle with this. If it's like a system description that's in like paragraph format spanning over like 3 pages, whatever, then they don't know what to then test, because then the first part of the task is identify what's key or what's a key control. The second component being then test what you've identified as key. And so students would then spend a lot of time testing controls that aren't necessarily key. It takes a lot of practice. Again, no two system descriptions are the same. So if you've seen enough of them, eventually you build up like sort of a gut feel, for lack of a better term, about what needs to actually be written down. I just also wanted to say that in terms of designing a system of internal controls, you want to be as descriptive as possible. What do I mean by this? Because you're trying to, like, the examiner must read the stuff and be convinced that you've addressed the risks, right, that are present. Must read the stuff and actually understand what it is that you're trying to do. I think I've seen in my experience that students are lacking when it comes to describing or designing application controls. So you want to be as descriptive as possible. You want to say the system should allow, or the system should be user-friendly and easy to use. The system should only allow alphabets in the name space. The system should only allow numbers in the cell phone number space. Like, so you want to give examples, as many examples as you can. The system should have an error message, for example, where a field has not been completed. You want the system to be or the what do you call them, the compulsory fields need to be marked by, say, a star, or whatever the case is. You want to be as descriptive as possible. I think you get the picture. And then lastly, I also want you guys to be aware of a spanner that can be thrown in the works as it relates to application controls, where the question will then scope in certain control objectives. So it'll say, it's fine, give me input controls, but I only want input controls that deal with accuracy. And so that would mean that you would need to make sure that you only describe stuff that speaks to accuracy. Or as was the case with the rainbow tea question with regard to processing, says discuss processing but only speak about accuracy as well as completeness. Don't touch on validity. So always be aware of those kind of little tricks. You don't want to annoy the examiner by like dumping everything. You also don't have enough time to be dumping everything, because as you can see, it requires a lot of thinking and obviously a lot of time for you to be able to put everything down on paper. So you want to make the best use of your time by reading the required properly, by responding to what the examiner has asked you, and obviously writing as fast as you can, right? And that's that on that. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do let me know in the comments if there's an aspect of, or you can do it via email, if there's an aspect of controls that you want me to address in a separate video. Like, I know it's a very broad topic, and I tried my best to like summarize it the best way I knew how here, but I know, for example, that some students might want me to touch on some other aspects in a bit more detail. So do let me know, and then I'll see what I can do. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.